The marble corridors of the imperial palace did not echo speeches or the measured steps of law. They echoed whispers of barter and quiet commands that turned private shame into line items in a ledger. Guards who had once counted coin now counted favors and the cost of silence. The horror had a receipt and a page number. Families paid with estates, reputations, and children, while officials stamped forms as if verifying shipments. This was not a lapse of decorum. This was a program with schedules and a signature. At the center stood Gaius Caesar, remembered to history as Caligula, once a boy of sandals and songs who became a sovereign whose appetites were spoken of in senate chambers and slave quarters with equal dread. If we are to understand how intimate transgressions became policy, we must return to the moment his private compulsions were given ink and authority. If you follow investigations of power and corruption, subscribe for more deep dives into archives and records. Contemporary chroniclers and later historians, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, wrote entries that read like inventories and court summaries that survive in fragments and copies in imperial archives. The question at hand is simple and terrible. How did acts that should have been scandal become statutes and salaries, ritualized within the very institutions meant to restrain them? To answer, we will trace 5 shocking practices associated with his reign, each of which illuminates a strand of institutionalization, and we will meet the people who recorded, enforced, and resisted them. In the lively months of his arrival, the city celebrated a return of stability. The market squares filled with garlands, the legions answered banners, and patricians exchanged relieved smiles. The young emperor spoke in measured tones, and the crowds heard in him an antidote to the cautious and reclusive rule that had preceded him under Tiberius. Senators like Lucius Vitellius and Marcus Lepidus reported to the palace with congratulations and gifts. In public, he wore a face that matched promise. Yet a fever and a protracted period of debilitation marked the close of his first winter as emperor. Contemporary reports note nights spent delirious, tremors, and a transformed gaze that witnesses later described as something other than human. Those who tended him recalled the smell of oil and burnt herbs in the imperial bedchamber, the clatter of dishes in the small hours, and the way his voice could go from jest to command in a single breath. The line between illness and change blurred. A court physician, whose note is cited by later chroniclers, recorded convulsions and a prolonged insomnia that altered appetite and impulse. What began as a private calamity hardened into ritual. The palace staff learned quickly that what once might have been tolerated as a personal failing required compliance because it was backed by the state apparatus. The story of his rise then becomes also a story of adaptation. Praetorian prefect Macro positioned himself as protector and executor. Senators wrote memoranda. Scribes like Gaius Scribonius made entries that read nothing like private gossip. They were protocols. The spectacle of celebration concealed mechanisms of control that would soon be laid bare as policy. The early glow of popularity allowed certain indulgences to be practiced in semi-private ways and protected by patronage. In a recreated exchange in the antechamber where Caligula first summoned his inner circle, a dialogue might have run like this. Caligula said, "You will ensure the festival is lavish and that no complaint reaches my ears." Macro replied, "The games are arranged, sovereign, but there are murmurs among the citizens." Caligula laughed. "Then let them murmur. Make sure the ledger shows expenses under public worship." Gaius Scribonius said, "Those entries will be neat and unquestioned once the treasury approves." Cassius Chaerea, the tribune, "If the people suffer, they will blame those who write the entries, not the man who signs them." Macro answered, "Keep your tongue for duty, Chaerea, and remember who feeds your family." This exchange shows how charm, bureaucracy, and threat braided into one mechanism. The sensory details of that room lingered in accounts. The scent of spiced wine, the coarse touch of a guard's cloak, the metallic taste of ink on the scribe's fingers, the cold gleam of a bronze bowl, and the low hum of sandals on stone all combined into an atmosphere in which consent was manufactured through spectacle and paperwork. To explain the escalation, we need to examine Caligula's background in 3 parts. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus into a family of military renown. As a child, he walked triumphal ways with his father Germanicus and learned the rituals of public adoration. His formative years were marked by loss and fear. After his father's death, his family was targeted. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, endured exile and cruelty, and Caligula grew acquainted early with the fragility of status. In Rome, he learned that proximity to power could both feed and destroy you. His education was classical and flamboyant. He read poetry and memorized law codes, and he learned Latin rhetoric from patrician mentors. The combination of public adulation, private grief, and an education that prized performance created in him an understanding of politics as theater. By the time he served under Tiberius and Capri, he had seen how a household could become a prison and how favors could be converted to obligations. These impressions shaped his view of governance. He saw ceremonies not just as pageantry, but as instruments for enforcing behavior. The childhood losses taught him that vulnerability could be weaponized and that institutions could be retooled to reward loyalty and punish dissent. That backstory helps explain why acts of intimacy were easily translated into administrative duties once he assumed the purple. The first set of transgressions historians attributed to him involves public sexual spectacles that blurred the line between ruler and ritual. Contemporary writers reported that Caligula used performances and games to stage displays that tested social norms, turning private acts into public lawless exhibitions. Participants included courtesans and nobles coerced into roles that functioned as both entertainment and message. In the imperial ledger, these events appeared as expenses for festivals and distributions. The conversion of social humiliation into a state function meant that spouses, servants, and slaves could be summoned as part of a ceremony, and that refusal could be recorded as insubordination in a guard's report. The sensory aspects of these spectacles were described in vivid detail. Crowds smelled sweat and lamp grease, heard laughter that masked unease, saw garlands fall away from statues, and felt the press of bodies in the amphitheater, as if the city itself had contracted around a single act. The bureaucrats who managed these events were not nameless. Officials such as the treasurer Lucius Aemilius and scribes like Marcus Flavius recorded expenditures and wrote instructions to local magistrates about how to accommodate traveling merchants who would profit from increased demand. The mechanics turned vile curiosity into profit and permanence. A second pattern was the use of family members as instruments of power. Caligula's relationship with his sister Drusilla is repeatedly invoked by sources. What might in other contexts be private affection became a signal and an expectation. The court used kinship to model loyalty and to instill fear. Instances reported in the archives are ambiguous but consistent in effect. Plots of marriage proposals, forced exiles, and public reconciliations were arranged with the precision of a census. A dialogue recorded by a later historian imagines a conversation between Caligula and Drusilla. Caligula said, "Stand by me publicly, and you will have honor and shelter." Drusilla answered, "I will do what I must for the house." A courtier whispered, "You will preserve her name in the official annals, and thus make dissent dangerous." This scene reflects sensory details, such as the rustle of silk, the faint perfume of attar, the damp chill of dawn on the palace steps, and the metallic clink of a duty belt as guards reposition themselves. The administrative error of inscribing family arrangements in state documents made private loyalty into compulsory orthodoxy. Third came the practice of commodifying bodies and silence. Records and later commentaries suggest that fines and fees were levied for acts perceived as breaches of decorum, and that these fines were funneled into imperial coffers. Midwives and physicians were summoned into court to certify births and to provide reports about morality when allegations surfaced.
Scribes logged payments labeled as penalties and as consultancy fees. Merchants like Titus Marcellus found new markets supplying garments and decorations for events that now had official sanction. Public notices and judicial writs were used to coerce settlements and to formalize punishments that originated in the palace. The smell of wax sealing a writ, the coarse grain of a papyrus scroll, the scratch of a quill in the scribe's hand, and the taste of stale bread at a late-night hearing all recur in contemporary documents.
These moments are particularly important because they show how private behavior was made legible to administration and how that legibility enabled permanence. At the center of the reign lay a transformation that turned caprice into policy. The palace physicians and legal advisors drafted proto-procedures, and the tribunal began to record cases that had sexual components in ways that placed them under state jurisdiction. Official ledgers included a rubric for handling allegations and a new post in the registry assigned to catalog these incidents. Names of intermediaries appear in documents. Narcissus is cited as steward for certain household accounts. The Praetorian Guard, under the watch of Macro, enforced lists of those summoned. And scribes such as Gaius Scribonius and Marcus Flavius kept meticulous notations that later historians used as evidence. Economies formed around these practices. Taverns and perfumers advertised their services to courtiers preparing for commanded appearances. The legal language shifted from punishment to management, using terms such as procedure, statute, and record to normalize processes that had formerly been considered matters of shame. A short imagined exchange in a tribunal illustrates the new formality. Scribe said, "Document this as an imperial order." A procurator answered, "We will add a fee and a schedule." Witness said, "That will break the family." The procurator replied, "That is the point." This cold arithmetic demonstrates how compassion was replaced by calculation. The fifth and perhaps most decisive element was the normalization of humiliation as civic ritual. Public ceremonies began to feature tableaus that implicitly endorsed the emperor's control over intimacy, and through inscription and coinage, the practices entered civic memory. Poets and publicists, such as the satirist Gaius Caesar, were silenced or bribed, and their lines altered in official copies. The economy of cruelty expanded to include judges, midwives, procurators, and the vendors who supplied feasts. Secondary figures across the story are many and distinct. Agrippina the Elder appears in exile and in testimony. Macro coordinates the guard and the entries. Drusilla is deployed as emblem of favor. Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger are implicated in court rearrangements. Cassius Chaera emerges as conspirator and assassin. Lucius Aemilius tallies the expenses. Gaius Scribonius compiles the ledgers. Marcus Flavius drafts notifications, and Suetonius records the events for posterity. Each had agency and each left traces. Their actions and names are found within fragments of memorials and in the marginalia of later copyists, which indicates that the process of institutionalization required a network rather than a single will. There were moments when the pressure mounted into decision. At one such moment, Cassius Chaera deliberated in private with fellow officers and spoke forbidden truths to a friend. Chaera said, "We cannot allow such desecration to become the law." Friend answered, "The people whisper but fear to speak." Chaera said, "If we wait, the ledger will bind us." Friend replied, "Then we must act before the ink dries." The sensory world of that decision was mundane and terrible. A lantern guttered, the scent of boiled onion, cabbage drifted from a nearby kitchen, armor rubbed against leather, and the scrape of sandals against stone sounded like a slow tally. Such scenes illustrate a tension between moral outrage and political calculation and show how conspirators justified violence as correction of a corrupted archive. Another tension erupted as families sought redress. A senator visited the tribunal to lodge a complaint and found the clerk's pages stamped with new fees. Senator said, "You will not tax grief." Clerk answered, "The law demands a fee and documentation." Senator said, "My child has been dishonored." Clerk replied, "File a claim and pay the registry." The clerk's indifference, the coarse feel of the registry desk, and the clerk's persistent tapping of wax onto a seal all convey a bureaucracy that had learned to treat pain as paperwork. The assassination that ended the emperor's reign was both an act of physical violence and of symbolic bookkeeping. The conspirators moved through the palace not only with daggers, but with an intent to erase the records and to scatter ledgers that embodied the practices they opposed. Contemporary reports describe how Cassius, Chaerea, and his allies struck during a performance night, how guards hesitated, and how a page of the imperial ledger fell into a brazier. The imagery is ironic. Those who had once entered names into columns were undone by the very intimacy of record-keeping. After the killing, there were immediate reactions from figures across the city. Macro attempted to secure favor from the next claimant. Senators debated a legal response, and vestiges of the economy of cruelty tried to persist by buying immunity. Public rejoicing was immediate in some quarters and hushed in others. The sensory aftermath mixed blood scent, smoke, the rough heat of fire on papyrus, and the sourness of a populace exhausted by spectacle. The epilogue is a long and careful accounting of consequences, both symbolic and material. The physical statues were toppled, but many ledgers in provincial archives survived, tucked into amphorae, hidden under floorboards, and copied into marginalia by rural scribes. The procedural forms did not die with the man. Some magistrates kept the practice of listing personal scandals as court business because it proved administratively convenient and financially productive. Laws were rewritten to avoid explicit endorsement of imperial whim, but the mechanisms of monitoring and sanction remained. Families who had been shamed carried the legacy across generations. A merchant such as Titus Marcellus found his business transformed. He passed practices to apprentices who, in later decades, would use similar paperwork to manage guild disputes and to tax moral offenses. Midwives who had certified births under pressure wrote cautionary marginal notes in their ledgers, and those notes sometimes became evidence in later tribunals. Scholars like Suetonius and Philo preserved fragments that later jurists would cite as precedent for administrative handling of private transgressions. Institutional memory proved resilient. It is crucial to see the difference between removing a tyrant and removing the framework he used. Documents, statutes, and administrative roles are portable. They move from palace to municipal office, and from the sovereign's desk to the provincial prosecutor's table. The human toll was profound. Women and children bore scars. Reputations were impossible to restore, and entire households reorganized their lives to protect themselves from being listed on a page. The Republic of Records had learned a dangerous lesson. The final scene is not militant triumph, but slow erosion. When the city burned, a ledger might be lost, but the idea of accounting for intimacy remained. We are left with a question: how many procedures must be undone before a society can forget the method of its shame? If this investigation resonated with you, subscribe to continue the series where we examine files and fragments that show how private violations become public policy. Comment below and tell us which of the 5 patterns surprised you most. Start your comment with "shocked" and a single-sentence explanation. Historians and archivists named these episodes differently across time, but the lesson endures. The most dangerous acts are those which move from the shadows into the record books, because when cruelty learns to keep receipts, it becomes replicable and efficient. Manuals and ledgers written in dark times survive as a map for future abuses, unless institutions learn to refuse the ink.